Hey, and welcome to the Intact Beyond Transformation series. I'm CEO of Intact Beyond, Nathan Dale. Thanks very much for joining us. We're a collective of subject matter experts who've all come together to help communities get through this time and thrive beyond. Facilitating today is Nicole Watson, and our subject matter expert is Ed Mallett. Ed's going to be talking to us about leadership, particularly at a time through change and in the wake of COVID, as well as values and cultural alignment, and how to be a leader and how to support a team through this transition. I'll throw it over to you now, Nicole, and thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, I'm Nicole Watson, and I'll be facilitating today's deep dive with Ed Mallett from EmploySure. Hi, Ed, how are you today?
Hi, Nicole, I'm good. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on board. Hey, look, it's been a difficult time, and I'm sure that EmploySure has been impacted, and lots of inquiries coming in with, with the current situation. How has this time impacted you and your business?
It's been curious, I think is probably the best way of putting it. At my best, I've in a way found the challenge quite exciting in a sort of perverse way, but at my worst, we're obviously all worried about business and jobs and so forth. But we've had the odd situation in that we help small business with workplace relations issues. So we've been flooded with inquiries about that. On the flip side, we're trying to keep a good eye on how small businesses are doing, whether they can continue to afford to pay our bills ultimately. So we've had this odd situation where we've been very busy, but we also have a business risk like everyone does really in the circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's such a strange time, and there's been some fantastic stories about businesses, really pivoting and completely changing their model and what they're doing. So I'm hoping that, we'll see a new generation of businesses coming out after this as well.
Exactly. I've seen a lot of those business stories coming out as well. I think pleasingly, the pivots haven't just been the total reinvention of what your business does, but also pivoting in the way people are managing their businesses and understanding how to become better managers, more decisive leaders, and pivoting themselves as much as their business, which has been inspiring to see.
Definitely. Well, what will we be focusing on today, Ed?
Good question. I've been asked to speak on, I'd say this with, I suppose, a bit of embarrassment, leadership. I'm not sure that I'm an expert on this. I'm just going to speak about what I've been doing through the crisis and how I've been leading EmploySure. To give you a sense of this, we as a business have about 900 people working for us across Australia and New Zealand. We've grown in just 10 years from just myself to that number. So we've always had a form of crisis going on in the business, if that makes any sense, in that that growth brings turmoil inevitably and trying to work things out on the go. But this has brought new challenges for me, and I've tried to condense what I've learned over those years into a pack of, for my own personal benefit as to how to manage the business and lead through the crisis. But I've found in speaking to our clients that they've found some use in understanding what we're doing. I'm going to explain a bit about that today.
Fantastic. Can't wait.
Great. Excellent. Shall I crack on?
Yes, please.
So what I'm going to do in a moment is share my screen, which has just got a short presentation on it that I'll run through. But before that, I just wanted to give a sense of the structure that I'm going to follow. As I explained, what I'm going to do is talk through the leadership approach I have taken to the crisis. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not a blueprint to success. I still don't know whether we're going to be successful through the crisis or not yet. All I can do is control the controllables and take one step at a time. And this gives you a bit of an explanation as to where I come from on that. As I say, I'm conscious of speaking about these subjects as some sort of know-it-all. I'm not a sort of poor man's Tony Robbins or anything like that. This is just what I've learned and what I've tried to translate into my own processes during this crisis. It looks particularly confusing on its face, but let me just work through it with you. And it really starts with this point. What I have done over the course of my time in managing EmploySure is I've been trying to understand this intersection between the purpose or mission of a business and then the values of the people that work for the business, which ultimately result in its culture. And in thinking about those two pieces, what I came up with this a while ago, was I came up with two triangles, which is like a value triangle, which you'll see under the title, What We Stand For, and then a purpose triangle, which sits to the left of that. Now, the organizational purpose that we will all have in some form or another is why we are there. It's our vision, it's our mission, why it is that the business exists. And that's the highest level principle in the business, I suppose, that you then translate with time down into a strategy as to how you are going to go about executing on that vision or purpose. And then finally, you have a set of plan items that you work to in order to deliver on that strategy. And that's represented in that triangle there to give some sense as to how I see those three things as coordinating. And I'll talk a bit in a moment about how we actually translate that into our work day to day at EmploySure, how we use that structure to help us guide through problems, including the COVID-19 crisis. Under the What We Stand For triangle, equally, you've got these sort of high principles when it comes to what we stand for. That starts with what's commonly called in organizational cultures as your values. And a lot of businesses will have those values stated somewhere, maybe in some sort of induction pack, maybe on the walls in their offices, those sorts of things. But in principle, there'll be a handful of words which are really just that unless you actually live them and give them meaning. Now, how do you give values meaning? And consequently, how do you create an organizational culture? Well, below values, I see it as you having a series of behaviors that you need to adhere to in order for those values to come to life. So to give you a snapshot of what I mean here in that respect. So at EmploySure, one of our values is commitment. Now, commitment on its own is just a word and it's a bit vague and it could sit on a wall. So we do a few things to help people understand what that actually means in the context of working at EmploySure. And we have a behavioral code that sits below our values. One of those behaviors that delivers into commitment is that you deliver on promise. You do what you say you're going to do. And we see that as a form of you showing your commitment to the organization. So we have a sequence of those lining up underneath each of our values to try and bring them to life. And then below that, we have what I've called commitments here. Now, if you haven't got your organizational culture quite right, you might scrub through that word and put rules. You might also call them disciplines or something like that. And that's, we stand for these things. These are our values. These are the behaviors we expect. These are the rules by which you abide in order to deliver into those behaviors, which deliver into the values. Now, if you've got your culture right, they don't feel like rules. They feel like commitments. They're things that as a group of people, we have said we will or won't do as an organization. And that's where you're getting right into the granular stuff, and probably too much really in a good, healthy culture. Too much or too many things to write down. The only place you might see those sort of things, though, is in a policy document, a manual that might say, look, these are the rules of working here. And this is how we behave day to day, essentially, which is what you sort of see in an employee handbook. But I set that up just as a starting point, just to give you some understanding as to how I think of organizational culture, but also establishing the purpose for a business.
Definitely. I think it's I think it's really interesting because I come from a HR and recruitment background, and the amount of times that you talk to people who work for companies and you ask them if they know what their values are, and they have absolutely no idea. And I myself am guilty of that. I've worked for businesses and had no idea what their values are. And so how can you expect people to live and breathe them if they don't actually know what they are? Because they are, as you said, in a manual. You know, you get them at the start, or maybe they are on the wall, but they don't mean anything because they are just words. So it's really interesting.
I see that as a responsibility as a leader to bring those to life. We do it in various ways here. First of all, we make everyone get them tattooed onto them. No, we do. We have a range of ways of getting people to remind themselves of what they mean and how they should consequently display in their behaviours. So yes, we have the stuff on the walls. We also quarterly review people by our values. We have a performance equation at work which says good performance equals not just your capability. In fact, the capability is not even the most important thing. It's your capability multiplied by your values squared. So we have this performance equation that we perform on everyone every quarter, saying, how did you do in respect of, using the one value I've highlighted, your commitment? What did you do in terms of your behaviors this quarter? Did you deliver on promise? Did you keep letting your manager down when you said, don't worry, I'll get that bit of work to you, and you didn't do it on time? That doesn't look like delivering on promise to us. And so we really get them into the language of the business. I speak a lot about them. So just about any communication, I use our internal communication tool, which is a thing called Workplace that Facebook is set up a bit like Slack. And we'll hashtag our values on there all the time to make sure that people are understanding them, talking about them. We even celebrate them through things like t-shirts, that people with the top values each quarter get awarded a t-shirt. So just trying to think of things to bring them to life all the time so that you have a good culture. Now, why do you bother having a good culture? You don't have to. And good cultures take all different shapes and forms. But really, when it comes down to it, it's culture that will get you through a crisis like this. It's culture that causes cohesion in a team, that when you're put under stress and strain is what sticks you together. And it is that glue that exists in an organization. Weak cultures, weak teams start to disintegrate under the pressure of crisis, change, and so forth when it comes about. So I like to think of us having a good culture here. It's not perfect. We make mistakes and we try to embrace those. But generally speaking, I think that we've got a good culture, and part of that is understanding exactly what we stand for. So I'll stand up on the first day of induction for every single employee and show a slide that looks a bit like this one. And I'll always, funnily enough, start with that quote up in the top right corner, which is that it says, leaders are storytellers. All great organizations are born from a compelling story. This central organizing thought helps people understand two things: what they stand for and why. So the why is your purpose. Why are we all here? You need to understand that as a great organization, but you also need to know what you stand for. So those are the two crucial things I ask people on day one. Or I try to help people understand on day one by being a storyteller as a leader. And I think that's a crucial recognition, I suppose, that anyone in a leadership role, and you don't need to be a managing director for this, but leadership in its essence is storytelling. And the substance of that story is in an employment environment, always trying to get across those 2 points. What do we stand for, and why are we here? And it's really as simple as that, and trying to think of different ways of telling those stories. So classically, for example, another one of our values is that the client is king. We focus very much on customer service. And what we will therefore do is, when we see great examples of customer service, we'll celebrate it internally and tell the story of what happened, so that people can continually see not just that Joe Bloggs did their job really well, but that is something that we stand for, and it's important we tell those stories. So, and that's, if I had to put I suppose a key characteristic of leadership to me, it is that you are a storyteller. Those are the two stories that you've got to get across. And through a crisis, the importance of being a storyteller only gets more and more. And if you look at the various leaders politically, governmentally, that we see around the world at the moment, the really good ones have been the really good storytellers. So Jacinda Ardern gets a lot of praise in New Zealand. And what she's great at, always has been great at, is telling story. Those that are not, and you don't need to be a brilliant orator for this stuff, but those that are not so good at it have not been great at telling story. They've also gone into their shell a bit and not spoken out as leaders. And It probably
think
takes
that's
me.
it's how you resonate with people as well, isn't it? You tell the story, but you also take them on that journey. And
Yeah,
when someone understands that common goal, and they live it, they breathe it, and they're going through that journey, it's a completely different scenario.
absolutely. Yeah, and it's hard, and going through that common goal, explaining it, and that sort of leads me on to the second slide, which is, okay, what does that look like in action? How do you actually do that? And I'd certainly look at other leaders that I admire, not just political ones, and say, what are they doing that I think is really good at the moment? And I really try and boil it down some core basics if you're looking at it as how to tell a story, if you like. So first of all, I've just got this on this second slide here, this thing called the teacup principle, which stands for think clearly under pressure. Another way of explaining it that we sometimes refer to internally is that worrying is not thinking. So one of the things that is crucial to being a good storyteller, particularly in crisis, is wearing a level of mask that doesn't tell people that you're, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but you're shit scared of the crisis as well. And you've got your own family to worry about. And you've got all of those things going on. You're worried about your own economic well-being as well as your physical well-being, your business, is it going to survive? All of the crisis and catastrophe. You've got to somehow put down a level of mask on that and think clearly under pressure, not worry, because if you worry, and you more still, if you worry externally, that's a characteristic that people don't follow in leadership, I find. So that was a starting point for me to say, look, for all of the chaos and crisis, I've got 900 people here that need to see me step up at this stage, and I've got to embrace that challenge and work through that. How do I do that? Well, first of all, I need a structure to communicate to them through, which I'll talk through in a moment, which this why, how, what piece, again, I'll talk to that in a second. But once I have that structure, it's important to do what I call own the narrative or lead the narrative. Make sure that you are in front of what is being said, not chasing it. So that quite often in an employment scenario, for people that are communicating, managers, leaders, the best litmus test for whether you're owning a narrative is whether, if you are giving a message that you are giving with such frequency and consistency that you're starting to get bored of it, you're probably just at that point getting through to people. And that's not intended to sound patronizing. I've actually stolen that idea from a webinar, or I think it's a YouTube clip that I saw by a chap called Jeff Weiner, who's the CEO of LinkedIn, and he talked about the fact that that's how you communicate with big groups of people. You've just got to give the same consistent message so frequently that you're almost bored of it, and just at that point you're probably in the magic spot of communication beginning to occur. And I think, just to give an example of it, and I hope this doesn't sound too down on our political leaders who are under great challenge at the moment, but I think, for example, in New South Wales right now, speaking towards the end of May, that what we're seeing is the government here losing the narrative. So when I look out of the window at how people are behaving, and I drive into work, I'm in the office here and it's busy, there are traffic jams, that is not in line with what they're saying the social restrictions are at the moment. And that to me looks like a leadership strategy that's starting to fail at this stage. People are starting to push at the boundaries of what's going on. And if they're not careful, they'll lose the narrative, which is not leadership. That's the opposite of it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next few days. Part of owning the narrative or leading the narrative as well is having a sort of a way of communicating with your people, whoever it is that your audience is, in my case, staff at work. And I do that. I have sort of 3 pillars that I've been using as a structure to that today. So first of all, I make sure that I do it at the same times each day, just so there's like a hook, a peg that it can be reliably hung upon. So I have, first of all, a small meeting at 8:30 every morning with our local crisis management team, essentially, to work through instant issues. Short half an hour, a punchy meeting. That's not to all staff, it's just a small group. But importantly, if I communicate to that group, I can then trust them to communicate to their groups and so on. I have externally have been conducting a few live streams or a daily live stream with clients and non-clients just through Facebook, which is somewhat miraculously ended up with quite a decent following. And but that was mainly to help businesses that weren't inside EmploySure, but actually what it did was end up being a communication tool to our staff as well, by them seeing me being visible during the crisis, stepping up. So it wasn't really the content of what I was saying from their perspective. It was more just I was saying something and I was out leading. And then the final piece is that at the end of every day, I send a message on workplace to our staff, and it's different themes. Sometimes it will be very functional. We are doing this as an organization. We will be opening this office. We're not doing this. This is how you need to act. Or it could just be more along the storyline of telling great stories about people's success in the business, or stuff maybe I've read that's helping me comprehend the crisis. But I put that out every day. And again, having given Gladys in New South Wales a bit of stick, I'll give her a bit of praise. Until I think a day or so ago, she was speaking every morning at 8 a.m., which is actually a really good example that very few leaders have done through the crisis, weirdly. You would have thought that that's the first thing that they would do, be just there, being apparent. And instead of actually at a federal level here in Australia, we've seen different time meetings. We don't know when they're going to occur. Suddenly they happen on a Tuesday. Yeah, that's you can see how organizationally in a business that would be pretty hard. People just don't know what's going on. They crave information, and the more you tell them, the better in that regard.
I feel a little bit lost as well, because I mean, even just taking it from what's happening, you know, at the moment, at the start, you know, I remember I was in front of the TV waiting for the update. And then one week, I think it just didn't come. And then I didn't know when it was coming. And I didn't sit down and necessarily have time to look through the TV guide or work out when the announcement's going to come. So it was just a case of, oh, if it's on, it's on. I'll catch up on it online. But before, you know, I was into that habit and that pattern. And my partner and I, you know, we'd sit down. And it was like, okay, what's next? You know, what's the go from here? So that consistency is completely key. And even in our business as well, you know, Nathan's been fantastic at, you know, every morning we have, you know, similar focus group, short, sharp meetings. And then, you know, he's releasing a video at the end of every week to give a bit of an update or as I said, on different things or innovation. And I think that's just being visible, as you said, and being accessible. You know, I think it's worked wonders for, you know, across the team, you know, whether or not someone's in Western Australia or, you know, in Victoria or in Sydney, we all feel that a little bit more connected.
Yeah, no, and being connected is important, and sometimes just the comfort blanket of something. The content's not necessarily, but it's the act of story is not just in the telling, but in it just being visible. In all of those examples are true. The more that is done, the better. And I heard some great ones during the crisis. I think the CEO of Salesforce.com is doing like a weekly interview with some super duper celebrity / business leader or something like that. And it's just the feeling of community. Oh, we're in this. They're speaking about our values. They're speaking about how we're going to get through this crisis. I'm being led by someone that's thinking and hasn't gone into a shell. I think is important, particularly in times of crisis. So that's I'm really the theme there is communication. And aside from the concept of telling a story, what we use at EmploySure, and I'm going to keep banging this drum. Maybe I can patent it as some sort of management tool one day. But what we use at EmploySure is for just about every project, problem, anything that we work through, we have a one-page thing that we say, okay, you've got to put on this one page why this problem exists or what your mission is to get through this problem, how you're going to do it, what's the strategy, remembering that triangle on the first slide, and what are you going to do, what's the plan to get through this. So I remember vividly the day that I realized that actually the crisis was happening, and I wasn't particularly early to the ball, to be honest, on that. I remember a mate saying to me one Friday morning, he's like, why are you in this sort of denial phase about this thing happening and talking about how ridiculous people are not shaking hands and things like that? Your job is not to work out whether it's right or not. Your job as a leader and a manager of a business is to manage through the crisis, to do risk management, to use a term. So I came in that Friday morning, and the first thing I did was say, okay, we need to establish what we call the why, how, what for this crisis. The why is the mission. What's the purpose of what we're trying to achieve through this crisis? And we kept it really simple through that, as I'll go through in a moment. I'll explain what EmploySure's one was. But I use that as a tool, like I say, for just about everything. And it's quite nice as a way of managing people as well, where they'll come to you with an idea that hasn't been properly distilled or thought through. And you can stop and say, what's the why for this? And if they're just thinking down at the what or the how level, it will cause them to sort of recoil and go back and properly think it through. So I know that, for example, Amazon, they do something a bit similar, but they do a much lengthier version. Apparently, in their senior meetings, if you have an idea at Amazon, you have to write a paper on it. And I think the papers are meant to be 8 pages long. And at any meeting, they sit down and they go in silence initially and just read the paper. And then sometimes at the end of it, they look at each other and say, do we even need to be here? Which is a way of doing it. I'm not a massive fan of that, because writing 8-page bits of prose is quite time consuming, and not everyone's great at expressing themselves through written word and stuff like that.
Sure, you deter a few people from actually presenting it. If someone said, if I had a great idea and it was like, okay, look, I want to hear it, but you've got to write 8 pages on it, I'd be like, God, I don't have time for that.
Yeah, no, I could, 8 pages, you probably get most of my life story into that. So having to fill out 8 pages on an idea might be hard, but 1 page isn't so hard, and we encourage people to go through that. So just, it's got a fancy name, or why, how, what, but really what it means is, what's the vision for this / mission? I'm always a bit confused about the difference between visions and missions, to be honest. I use them interchangeably. What's the strategy? How are we going to do this? And what's the plan? What are we going to do to achieve this? What are the granular steps that we're going to go through to achieve this? So on that Friday, that's what I did, was come in and say, look, we need to do that for EmploySure for this crisis. And again, going back to that idea that all communication should be clear, concise, and consistent, this goes really in the concise bucket initially. You've got a 1-page document that you can share with staff. They can understand exactly what's going on. But it also enables you to be consistent going forward. So quite often in that half-hour meeting in the morning, and in other meetings I've had during this, people will be going off maybe on a more optimistic tangent as to how the crisis is going, and I'll drag them back to what our 1-pager says about that. So it gives you a good rudder through crises, which I think is really important. And then finally, it's clear. So clear, concise, consistent communication is a mantra that I try and live out with my own communications and try and promote within the business. So in terms of what that actually meant for EmploySure, the why, how, what. So we established, I called a couple of people into my office that day and said, okay, we're not leaving here until we've done our why, how, what on this. The why we ended up with was very simple. These things don't need to be sort of, you don't need to engage top advertising agencies to work these things out for you. They don't need to be poetic. They've just got to be a way of communicating to your staff. So all we said in terms of our why or mission for the COVID-19 problem or crisis was that what we were aiming to do was achieve business success throughout the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. So that's become a headline essentially to every action that we take at the moment, just trying to achieve business success throughout the crisis and beyond. How are we going to do that? Well, actually, funnily enough, in the paper that day, I read something about a guy at Dexus, the property manager, the CEO there, and he said something along the lines that in terms of how he was going to manage the crisis was that he's done crisis before, and what he always does is prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. And we said, okay, that's a strategy. That's a strategy in a sentence. We're going to tweak it slightly because we don't like hope. Hope sounds a bit vague. You just so what we say here in terms of our how for the crisis is that we are preparing for the worst, but planning for the best. So we're making sure we're nimble enough to be good, but also prepared enough for things to go really bad. And at that moment, that then started to develop what items are from that. So if you're going to prepare for the worst, one of the first things you need to do is create a form of budget or forecast which says what is your worst case scenario. So we went off and did that immediately, rather than doing what I think a lot of businesses did in those first weeks, which was start rushing to their cost base and cutting costs, maybe making people redundant. And then later on, they found out if they hadn't done that, they could have used JobKeeper and kept that person's talent in the business and so on. So instead of slipping into teacup, worrying, not thinking, trying to use this structure to avoid that worry and create good decision making. And in this regard, making sure that we had a sequence of what items. So our what items, beyond creating that worst case scenario, became defined by a series of phases that we started to develop. And that's on this slide here. Another thing that I'm shamelessly going to try and patent, but it'll probably be a bit useless once the crisis is open, but is over. Sorry, but we basically said, look, there are 4 stages to this. There is denial. So that's the stage I'd just come out of in that Friday morning. I'm still trying to shake people's hands and saying this is a load of rubbish. It's no worse than flu stuff that, and I still do it, to be honest. I mean, we probably all do. My bad habit is that I'm English, so therefore when I go to bed at night, one of the last things I do is read English newspapers as they're waking up in the morning, and they're filled with all the drama and noise of what's going on in England, and I start getting angry about that. And it's got really nothing to do with me. It doesn't help me in my job or anything like that. So that's me like in denial, saying this is ridiculous, it's an overreaction, and all the other things that we all feel at some stage or other. But I use this structure to say, don't go into denial, because that's not one of your what items. You've got to stay out of denial. You need to stay in, first of all, crisis management. So all of the various things that we did under crisis management, we bucketed in here, and we have that half-hour meeting each morning to deal with it. So that included moving the majority of our workforce home, going through what a lot of office-based businesses had to do, understanding what government advice was saying at that time and what it was changing to. So we still have that half-hour meeting every morning to update on what's happening in all the different states, in New Zealand, defining whether we're going to work to the lowest common denominator amongst those states, or do we open offices at different times, and all of those sorts of things. All of the plate spinning, if you like, that goes on in crisis management, we were doing in that section. And we purposely said that half an hour meeting is for that. You cannot do anything else in that meeting. Put some brackets around it and just deal with that every day. And we're still doing it every day and will do for some time to come. The second stage of what items, or second bucket of what items that we addressed, was planning. So that was slightly more cool-headed, not running around spinning plates, but saying, okay, we've got this, and this is where the worst case scenario forecast came in. We said, we've got this document. That means that if things go in that direction, we're going to end up with a cash gap that looks like this. How are we going to reduce costs in a way that doesn't do it too quickly in case things don't go that way, but isn't so slow that we're left with the same cost basis that we should have as if we were doing really well through the crisis. We needed to be nimble enough. And we ended up with a sequence of cost reduction measures that we're still going through. We're not at the end of it. We've got various future stages potentially if our business goes in a certain direction. But it started off on the basis that we said, look, what we're not going to do, we're going to avoid staff cost reductions as far as we can. We're certainly going to avoid job losses as far as we can. So we made a series of cost reductions initially that were probably culture related, but not people related. So that included getting rid of a lot of the free things that we provide as part of our culture here, free breakfasts, things like that, that actually when we added them all up were really quite significant in a business with as many people as we have now. Then we went through a second phase later, by which time JobKeeper had arrived. So we had a much clearer idea as to which tactics we could apply to the problem to solve it. If we need to save this much more money, how do we do that? And we were able, therefore, to plan with a bit more forethought, care, and that in turn enabled us to communicate in a way that wasn't hazardous, it wasn't rushed, didn't feel panicked to the staff. I say all of that, maybe it did, but that was my intention, certainly, to avoid that feeling of a leadership group that didn't know its arse from its elbow and were just randomly making cost cuts, and then suddenly this week went better than last, and they weren't in control of that narrative. So those were the things that we went through in planning. And then finally, Nicole, just picking up on your point earlier about pivots, we have, again, a separate meeting on top of that, which we call an opportunity meeting. And that's looking at things that have come out of this crisis that we should be looking to bring into the business on a more permanent basis. The classic one early on, and we'll talk about this at the end, I think, was loads of people at the start of the crisis said, oh, wow, my whole workforce is at home now. They're just as productive. Maybe I don't need an office. And my view is that that's not quite right, nor should it be. But we looked at what we've learned from that, from technology like Zoom and other technologies that people are using day to day. How could we integrate that into our business to give better customer experience, reduce costs, higher staff engagement, reduce travel, all of those kind of things we started to look at, as well as other aspects of the crisis that we've seen work well. For example, some marketing tactics that we have used, the live stream, for example, we never would have done before, but we're saying, well, maybe we should do that more often, and things like that that provide us with opportunity. So by breaking down the what items into those 4 buckets and crucially, I think, separating them into different meetings, we've enabled the thinking to be quite channeled and also to progress in a way that has then enabled us to communicate consistently, clearly and concisely with staff. So that's a sort of, I suppose, an insight into how I've been dealing with the crisis, particularly here. I've just got a couple of slides just to finish on as to what I would take away myself from what I think I've done okay, what I haven't done quite so well, and so forth. Is that one of the things I see consistently in businesses, and bear in mind we deal with about 27,000 small businesses, the overwhelming sentiment that I have seen from them in this crisis is a high degree of care for their staff. To a large degree, to be honest, and this is where it's hard for me to advise it without sort of coming across as the bogeyman to my own staff. But I think business managers and leaders sometimes forget that they have multiple hats and need to look at those hats critically and work out which one takes precedence. So I think there are 3 hats that you wear as a leader in a business. The first is your business hat. That's your fiduciary duties, to use the technical term. It's your responsibility to the shareholders, whoever they might be, to run the business successfully in brief. The second hat is, as part of that, your people hat, employer hat, to look after and be a guardian of your workforce within the context of your culture. And the third one is probably a personal or private hat, which is making sure you're looking after your own private interests with your family and keeping them safe and so forth. Now, what I've seen consistently through the crisis is people putting precedence on the people hat to the expense of the business leader hat. So it seems like a really nice thing, but the classic one for me at the moment is lots of businesses going out and getting JobKeeper, when that might not actually be the best tool to solve their business problems. So it may be that it's unreasonable or unfeasible for them to keep all of their staff through the crisis, but they're using JobKeeper to stop having to make that hard decision. And I made this point earlier about the kind of pivots that I've seen that I quite admire. And some of the best ones I've seen have been business owners that have sort of taken their head out of that sand and said, you know what, I need to grip my business, and I'm not here just to keep everyone happy. I'm not a social security. I'm not here to do jobs for people unless those jobs exist, and actually grappling with that as a business owner. That's one of the toughest things as a leader, is to work out when you're going to have to deal with other people in that way, and make sure that your business hat ultimately takes precedence, because that is the requirement, both as a matter of law, but in a practical sense, that's what you've got to do as a leader, and make shitty, tough decisions sometimes, and you need to grapple with those rather than put them off. So the last one from me is this, is that undoubtedly I say with a little bit of caution, we're closer to the end of this than the beginning. I don't know when the end will be. None of us do. You've got to carry on, as I said at the start, controlling the controllables and just moving forward step by step. I think you even need to be prepared to go backwards if necessary. If we have a second wave, that's exactly why you wouldn't be rushing out now and sort of popping champagne corks and thinking it's all finished, because it hasn't. We're still in the midst of it. But I hope, and it seems that we're closer to the end of it than the beginning. The important thing I think to take away from that is that a lot of leaders were very pleased with themselves about how they got into the crisis. They got people home quickly. Wasn't that miraculous? I didn't think I could do that with my workforce. We're all still here. The world, contrary to popular opinion, didn't actually end. There are just lots of different challenges for us to deal with. But I don't think that leaders will be judged on how they started the crisis. I think whether it's politicians, Boris in the UK seems to be getting judged in this regard at the moment. It's not how you get into the crisis, it's how you get out of it. And that seems to be the focus now, and the focus I'm trying to give here, which I'm using this mantra here that it's time for us to finish strong. So really good teams, really good cultures. We talk a lot here about the All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby team, and the strength of their culture. That quote I used at the start was from a book about them. And we talk about how well they finish constantly. Just when everyone else is flagging and tired, the really good teams step up and accelerate. And that's what we're trying to do here. And that's really the next stage of leadership that I'm trying to spend my time on at the moment. I don't know exactly the why, how, what for that at the moment, but I'm working through it.
You don't have your crystal ball in front of you at the moment then, Ed?
No, sadly not, no. And in a way, I think sort of being short-termist, in a twisted way, being a leader through this is easier than being a crystal ball guy. The Steve Jobses of the world that can see the future in a way that most of us can't. Leading through a crisis to some degree is easier than that, because you don't need to see the future. You need to have pretty short planning cycles. In fact, you don't want to get carried away trying to predict the future, because it's unlikely to help you in the long run.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that's what I mean. I mean, like, we can take this time as an opportunity to really look at our processes, to look at, how we, what it is that we stand for as a business, look at our culture, look at our client relationships, and really tighten up on all of that, so that when we come out of this, we are stronger. We're better prepared. And I mean, I've learned some skills since working from home. I think resilience is a big one. Patience is something else. I mean, I think I mentioned to you earlier, I actually started my new job during this period, and even just in terms of getting to grips with technology, onboarding, using all the systems that I've got no idea how to use, you just take for granted, tapping someone on the shoulder, asking them for help. And then in a personal sense, I've definitely taken for granted going for dinner with my partner, going out to see my friends. And I actually have my first dinner planned tonight, which I cannot wait. First dinner in a restaurant, so really looking forward to that with my friend Olivia. So that'll be great. But look, if you did have a crystal ball, and I'm not going to hold you to this, but what trends do you see happening and taking hold of the workforce and the workplace beyond this period?
Good question. I should just say as well that I'm at an age, sadly, where COVID-19 has had zero net effect on my social life. I think, but for the work side of it, I probably wouldn't have noticed it going on. But what does the crystal ball say about the future of the workplace generally? My view is that, funnily enough, the day that the handshaking stopped, I was at a seminar on the future of work, which was focused very much on things like artificial intelligence and automation, people losing jobs to technology. Now, I think, funnily enough, that COVID-19 will take us backwards in that regard. So there's a lot of talk about the office disappearing. I don't think that will happen. I think the office is crucial to that culture triangle. It's very hard for organizations to communicate really successfully with each other without being together in some format. you can see an example of that in teaching at the moment. It's really hard to do. I think we'd all, not just for the practicality of doing homeschooling, but we'd throw our arms up in the air if people said, oh, by the way, classrooms are now finished. You'd say, well, what about their social life? What about this? What about what they'll learn from their peers and all the other things? And that's still true in a workplace. We still need those environments to learn and grow, not just in formal structures, but just from what you pick up from other people day to day. So I think the office will continue to exist. It might change a bit in terms of the way we communicate and how frequently use things like Zoom. In terms of that automation piece, though, I think what we've seen is that jobs are a fundamental part of our societal fabric, in that we will have this sort of safety valve or safety stop, which will stop automation from going too far, because we say ultimately we need jobs to live and exist, and we need money in our pockets to go out and spend money in order to make sure coffee shops are still running and this is still running and that. I can't see post-COVID a way in which the concepts of automation, that the true visionaries like your Elon Musks and so on, I don't think their vision of the future is going to accelerate because of COVID. I think it's quite the opposite. It will go backwards a bit to a society which really actually values and cares for senses of community, and valuing jobs within those communities.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more. And I myself am massively missing that sense of community. I've always been someone who's, worked from home a fair bit, so it wasn't too, foreign for me. But I am missing, going in on a Monday and being with your team and, all setting your priorities and getting yourself G'd up for the week, and then, celebrating, at the end of the week and going, oh, it's been a great week, or the opposite, it's actually been a really shitty week, and I want to drown my sorrows with my workmates and then celebrate, and take the good pieces of that period as well. So I think it'll be a bit of a mix moving forward, but as I said, neither of us have a crystal ball or can see into the future as much as we'd like to. So I guess it's just an opinion, but I've spoken to quite a lot of people and asked them, similar questions, and everybody has a very different idea about what the future will hold. So I just hope that we can take, some of the positive things that we've learned from this experience, and continue on with those into the future.
Yeah, agreed. I think that we will. I don't think the normal will be the same normal going forward, but you can perhaps see over my shoulder, we've got people back in our office now, and people are being sensible, but I do think that they're enjoying. I can see smiles on people's faces. They're pleased to have that contact again, albeit from a distance. And I personally hope that's the case, because we've invested a lot of time in our culture, and we care a lot about that and see that as a key part of our success.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. Well, look, thank you so much, for joining us today, and on behalf of the Intact Beyond team, thank you for your time and sharing your expertise.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you
very much.
Bye.